All right, welcome back. In the last video, what we looked at was we had a list of volunteers, and if we wanted to create a new volunteer, we could go in here and we could create a new user. Now, the scenario will also come about where maybe there's something about this existing user, I don't know, they changed their phone number or something. We want the ability to go in and update this user. Right now, we can't do that. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to create another button so that we can edit the user. And when we click on the button, it's going to bring us to this screen, but it'll be pre-populated with our user information. And instead of saying create new volunteer or create new user, it's going to say edit volunteer, edit. Load their image and their birthday and their phone number and everything so we can go in and just update it. So we're probably going to do this into 2 video segments. The first one is going to really focus on how do we add this button that will allow us to go to this scene and preload the scene, because right now we do not have that ability to preload the scene. So let's start with that. So if we go to our view, go into our controls here, and I'm going to drag in, whoops, I'm going to drag in a button into our bar here, and we'll call this one edit volunteer. And one thing that I like to do, and maybe it's just a me thing, but I like these buttons to all be the same size. So I tend to look at the biggest button. If I look at the layout of this, I can see it's 166 pixels wide. So what I can do is I can click on both of these buttons. I'd use the control button here so I can get both of them. And I'm going to say the preferred width, if it's just a hair bigger, I'll say I want them both to be 170 pixels. And then now they're the same size and just the words are a little different. All right, so save that. And if we want, what we need to do now is hook up this button to our view. So we need to go to our controller class. So we're in the volunteer table controller. And in here, in the initialize method, we had set up a few things. Our table self-factories, and then we load the table. But one of the things is if we haven't selected a user, we shouldn't be able to push this button. If you leave this button enabled without selecting a user, likely what will happen is you'll end up creating null pointer exceptions and things like that. So what I'd recommend is disable this button until the user selects a row. So let's do that. So here we'll create our button. Then we can hook it up in our scene builder. So I'm going to go down to code. Off it, click on it. Oh, I still don't have the drop down, which means that although I've added it here, I have not saved. So you see up here, you have to hit the save. So I'll click on to a different button, click come back. Now we can see the drop down is populated and we can save it. And now in our initialize method, we say disable the edit button until a volunteer has been selected from the table. So now I can say edit volunteer button, table to be true. Save. So now we run this. See how it's disabled, right? I can't click it. Now what I need to do is I need to set it up so that if I do click it, this becomes enabled. So to do that, I'm going to create a little method, and this will be, let's see here, let's call it volunteer selected. And then all I have to do here is all right. And so basically, if I look in the table now, if I look through my table object, I can see there's several different types of events that can happen here. So if they sort it, drag detected, drag done, and there's this one down here that says on mouse clicked. So if I click the mouse on the table, that means I've selected a row. So here, I'll say volunteer selected. Hit save. So let's test drive this. Okay, so if I click on it, then it enables my button. I click on the button, it doesn't do anything, but it was enabled once we had a user selected or a volunteer selected from our table. Now, the other thing we need to do here is we need to look at our scene changer. So in our scene changer previously, we basically had one scenario. We changed the scene, so we give the new view, right? The new view, and we give it a little title. Now, in this case, we need to, I called it the new user view. Maybe I should have given it a different name, but I don't want to create an entirely different view for functionally the exact same things. So what I need to do is I need to pass in the user, okay, like the person that's going to be selected here. So what we're going to do is we need a different scene changer. And this is a little bit more complex because we actually have to, when we change scenes and we want to pass information in, we have to actually get a hold of the controller class, and then we can change the scenes. So so this method will allow we're going to use some of the same things. So we're going to use an action event. And we still need the view name. We still need to give it a title. We also need to pass in the volunteer. And we need to pass in an instance of the controller class. So remember, every view has a controller class, and we need to be able to get access to that controller class so we can call methods to preload things. So I'm going to get them here called controller class. And we're going to have to bring in a we're going to have to bring in the class. We're going to have to import our volunteer. Right, so this one was called models volunteer. Models volunteer. Now this is the interesting one, is our controller class. So what we need to do is we need to create instances of excuse me. We need to have the way to pass in the controller class. And what we're going to do is I'm going to force all of the classes that use this. So we're going to force them to have a couple of methods called preload data. One of them is going to take in a volunteer, and one of them is going to take in the volunteer ID. So in this case, we're going to pass in the actual volunteer. So let's go here. And in my views, I'm going to create a generic controller class. So I'm going to call this controller class. And I'm going to define this controller class that it is, actually I'll make it an interface actually, because we're not going to instantiate it. So interface. And we're going to make sure that all instances of this class have a method called preload data. And it'll take in a volunteer object. Okay, so all that this does is it's going to force any classes that implement this interface to have a method called preload data that accepts a volunteer. And I'll show you why that's super helpful for us. Okay, so if we go to our scene changer, okay, and we want to pass in a controller class, zoom out a little here so we can see this better. It's going to look a lot like the other fxml loader. And then what we're going to load is our view. So in here, it's going to be the view name. And because we're loading something, has the potential to throw an IO exception. So we have to account for that in our method. Okay. So this looks exactly the same as when we were changing scenes before, right? This part looks exactly the same. And in fact, so is this, the next couple of lines. These are the same too. But where this is going to differ a little bit is after we've got our scene, we need to access the controller class and preload the data. But to do that, I'm going to say controller class. This is the controller class that was passed in. Okay. Because I won't necessarily know which controller I'm using. That's why it's a generic, I've just made it an interface, right? So I don't know whether it's the volunteer table controller or it's going to be, you know, the new user view controller, or if it's, I don't know, the log hours view controller, something like that. So this is just a generic controller. And then once I have this loader, because I have this, I'm forcing anything that implements the controller class to have this method called preload data. In here now, I can say controller class preload data, and we'll pass in the volunteer. So in a universal way, now I can ensure that I can preload the data. Then I can set the stage, and then I can say, stage, set the title, be whatever the title is. So in this case, we said it would be called title. And then we can say stage, set the scene. So the big difference here is this bit. So now let's go take a look at our controller class that we want to pass in. So in our view table controller, if the edit button is pushed, so let's make this somewhat alphabetical here. So if the edit button is pushed, so let's do public void edit button. Now we're going to create a scene changer. Scene changer. And we can say scene changer dot change scenes. You see we've got these two options here. So this time I have the same view. So it's going to be the new user view controller. This time we're going to say edit volunteer. And we need to pass in the volunteer. So we need to select that volunteer from the table. So to do that, I'm actually going to do it in 2 steps just to make it a little easier to see. I'm going to say volunteer equals. And we need to pull this from the table. So the table is called volunteer table. And then we can get the selection model. And then we can get the selected item. So that will return a volunteer object, which we can then pass in. And then we have to pass in the controller class. Now the controller class is going to be the new user view controller. Well, let me do it that way. Okay. So let's try. So yeah, it isn't going to let it. All right, so let's do this. Person view controller equals. Oh, I called the new user. Okay. So this creates an instance of the new user view controller class. And if I go to put it in here, new person view controller, it'll complain. It says here that it's expecting a controller class, but what it's got is this new user view controller. So it's expecting a generic controller class, and it's got a specific one. So what we need to do is we need to tell the new user view controller that not only does it implement initializable, but it's also going to implement the generic controller class. And that should have made it happy. Why is it not? Oh, there we go. And now it says, okay, so now this whole method call is going to generate an IO exception potentially. So we need to handle that. So this allows us to go to the new person view controller. This is upset now because by making it, because we said it implements the controller class, which is, I should have called it controller interface, but there's an abstract method in here that we haven't implemented. So I'm going to implement that. And if we come down, there's a method called preload data, but there's nothing in here. So what we need to do now is we need to think about, okay, we've now got a volunteer, okay, in our view. So how do we want to handle that? So we can create something to hold that volunteer. So I'm going to call it volunteer. So now we can say this dot volunteer equals the volunteer that was passed into this method. And now we can start updating our view. So things said about our view, here it is. So there's a few things. One, we need to preload all of these fields now that we have our user. So we go back here, our fields. So for example, first name text field is going to be equal to volunteer and get their first name. Okay, why is this subset? Strings cannot be converted to text. To set the text. What else is left here? Number. Okay, so let's even just look at this. Let's give this a little test drive at this point, and then we'll look at doing the image because that's a little bit more work. So if I click on Wilma here, I click on Edit Volunteer, I guess I didn't connect it. So let's go into our view, click on Edit Volunteer. Edit button pushed. Okay, so something crashed here. Let's take a look. So if we go look at the stack trace, we can see volunteer view, volunteer table view controller line 54. Then it calls scene changer in line 45, and that's where we had some problems. So it didn't want to load. Legal state location is not set. So let's take a look here then on line 45. Oh, line 54. And here's the problem. I have my controller class here, which is supposed to be our view. So this should be .fxml. So it sends over to our create new user view. It's changed the title to be edit volunteer. We need to update this label, and we need to update the image, but it looks like the rest of it was pre-populated, which is fantastic. So then you could, we'll also need to set it up in such a way that if this was pre-populated, when we hit save, it's gonna insert, it will update the record. We'll do that in the next video. Actually, this video is probably pretty long enough right now. So what we'll do is, we'll change this label right here. And then we'll end this video. In the future video, we'll update this image and figure out how to update the database. So to handle changing this label, right now, that label does not have an ID associated with it. So we can't control it. So let's go to our controller. And we'll add another label. And if we've passed, if we're preloading data, then header label should say edit volunteer. So click on Fred. We click on edit volunteer. Oh, didn't like that. Let's see what happened. We got a null pointer exception. So this typically happens if you define something here, right, with this add fxml tag. That means it's expecting to see it in the view. So if we go back to the view, and if I click on this label, you can see we didn't actually connect it. So let's connect it. Hit save. So click on Albert Einstein, go to edit, and now it says edit volunteer, and it's preloaded with all of Albert's things. So the next video, we'll figure out how to preload this image, and we'll work on how to update versus insert a new record. Thank you.